Hello to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and Facebook, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I am Robin Browne with my co-host, Libby Davies. Hey, Libby.
Hey.
And I'm joining you tonight from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people.
And I'm joined this evening from the unconquered territories of the Seminole peoples as I prepare to attend the Miami Book Fair this week.
So today's panel will focus on Canada's cannabis industry, and specifically, who are the ones profiting most from this industry and what the legalization of cannabis means in the larger context of drug policy reform in Canada. This evening, we're joined by a wonderful group of folks to help us shed light on this subject. First, it's my pleasure to welcome back Chuka Ejeckam. Hey, Chuka. Chuka is a writer and policy researcher and a Rabble columnist. His work focuses on inequity and inequality, drug policy, structural racism, and labor. It's great to have you back to our panel, Chuka.
Hi, Robin. Hi, Libby.
Hi.
A warm welcome to Jodie Giesz-Ramsay. Hey, Jodie. Jodie has been an advocate for cannabis and civil liberties since 2004. Jodie owns and operates Cannabis Culture Magazine, Pot TV, cannabis culture stores and lounges, and a hemp-themed coffee shop called Jodie's Joint. She's been arrested and convicted for her peaceful civil disobedience and remains passionate about human rights and drug policy reform. Welcome, Jodie. It's wonderful that you can join us tonight. And rounding out our panel, welcome to NDP Member of Parliament for Vancouver Kingsway, Don Davies. Hi, Don. Don was elected in 2008. He is the NDP critic for health and deputy critic for foreign affairs and international development. Very glad you can join us tonight, Don.
Great to be with you all.
All right. I want to note that my co-host, Libby Davies, a former member of Parliament, has played a significant role in drug policy reform and in ending criminalization in Canada over the past 20 years. And we look forward to your insights tonight as well, Libby.
Okay.
A special welcome also to everyone who registered for this event on Zoom. Please participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we will do our best, as always, to address your questions. And finally, for those of you watching on Facebook, hello to everybody. A reminder that if you'd like to participate in future events, simply sign up to Rabble's free newsletter to get a notification for the Zoom invite, and just go to rabble.ca/subscribe. Now I will turn it over to Libby to kick off tonight's panel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robin. It's always great to co-host Off the Hill with you. And hello to all of our guests tonight on the panel. Great panelists, I have to say. And also to everybody who's watching tonight. So as Robin said earlier, this panel is going to focus on Canada's cannabis industry. The struggle to end the so-called war on drugs in Canada has been epic and harmful, very harmful, over many decades. Many lives have been lost and destroyed because of prohibition, and many people, especially racialized and Indigenous people, have been criminalized and imprisoned. So we're focusing tonight on the legalization of cannabis, but of course, that needs to be examined within the context of Canada's overall drug policy regime. Now, marijuana was legalized by the Trudeau government in 2018, and it did reduce drastically the number of cannabis-related drug convictions, but it also created a multi-billion-dollar industry. So the first question tonight, really, to kick us off is, what does the cannabis industry look like today? We've posed the question, who wins, who loses, and what does this mean for Canada's drug policy reform overall? So our expert panel will look into these issues and much more. So to just kick things off, our first question, the federal government recently launched a mandated review of the Cannabis Act. This was part of the legalization regime. And so I'd like to start the conversation and ask each of you, how important is this review, the mandated review, 4 years after cannabis was legalized in Canada? So maybe, Don, we can begin with you on that. What are you thinking about this review that's taking place?
Well, thanks, Libby. Well, the first thing I would note is that the government's already in violation of their own legislation, because the statutory review of the Cannabis Act was by law, supposed to start within 3 years of the passing of legislation. We're now over 4 years. And they apparently have made some steps to start it, but I think that they're behind. I think, to answer your question really specifically, I think the review is critically important. I sat through the health committee as we reviewed the legislation in draft form, and I can tell you the serious problems with it that were apparent at the time was the government was clearly regulating an industry they didn't understand. And it was still very much, I think, infused with a reefer madness perspective behind it. And so the result is that the legislation, I think, is it's not bold enough. It fundamentally misunderstands the nature of cannabis and the cannabis culture and community. And therefore, it really, while I think it was successful in the sense that it has legalized something that never should have been criminal to begin with, it really didn't get it right. And so where I'll end and leave it to my colleagues to pick up is, to this day, about 50% of cannabis is still produced not in a legal setting in this country. We still have people who are walking around with criminal records. And I think, I'm very bullish on cannabis. I think Canada has an opportunity as the first G7 country to legalize cannabis, to be a world leader in high quality, safe, and marketable products, not only cannabis, but all of the associated intellectual property and equipment and technology that goes along with it. And so I think it's pretty much a lost opportunity, and this review is a chance to address those failings.
Okay, that's really great. And if I can just turn it over to you, Jodie, I know that you've been quite active on Twitter recently about the review, encouraging people to participate in the public consultation process. So tell us, share with us, how important is this review for you and the work that you've been doing?
Actually, just before Jodie gets into that, Don, you mentioned reefer madness. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, well, it's a shorthand term for a movie that I think was produced in the 1960s, and really it contains every myth and hysterical kind of inaccurate scare tactic about cannabis. It was meant to scare off people, and it basically, I think, is now shorthand for this, the view that cannabis or other drugs are dangerous or immoral, or somehow some are to be avoided. And I think the main point about it is that it really perpetuates a lot of misunderstanding and inaccuracy about drugs in an attempt to scare people off from using it or having an evidence-based approach to it. So that's, I think, yeah.
Thanks for that, Don. So Jodie, in terms of the review and how you're seeing it, you've been encouraging people to get involved in the review.
Yes, absolutely. I think even though it can be very difficult to change such enormous things like policy, cannabis policy, anything, it can be overwhelming and somewhat discouraging, but it takes a lot of time and hard work to change things, and every little bit counts. So we did spend many years, even before my time, people spent decades engaging in activism, running for office, calling in radio shows, writing letters to newspapers, marching in the streets, engaging in civil disobedience and educational efforts. That work was long and slow and tedious, but it does chip away at the wall of prohibition. The problem with prohibition and the criminalization of cannabis and other drugs, I think the reason it's so harmful is because the prohibition is based in discrimination and hatred and misinformation about groups of people. In fact, reefer madness, a lot of that was based back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It was based on racism. And the war on drugs has been based on racism too. It's been used to not just arrest people and charge them, which is one way to cause harm, but it causes a discrimination, a stigma, leads to people not having employment opportunities and housing issues in courts with respect to children and custody. So the harms go far beyond just the simple criminalization. I think the review is really important right now because people like myself spent many years very publicly trying to warn everyone about how bad the legislation was looking and the harms that would probably come from it. Now, instead of being told, oh, just wait and see, we've waited, we've seen, it's a disaster and we need to fix it. So the review is essential, but if people just say, oh, it's legal, it's done, whatever, we're not going to see any changes. So this review gives us a chance to address a lot of issues with respect to medical marijuana, over taxation, over regulation, and the list goes on and on. So I do encourage people to take part.
Yeah, Jodie, have you found it difficult to get people engaged in the review? Like they think, oh, well, it's not going to make any difference. Or are people thinking, no, I really want to, get my stuff out there and be heard on this issue? What's the response been to your call for people to get involved?
I see that the commercial side, the smaller part of the legal industry, the craft growers, the mom and pop shops, they've been suffering. They're not really grouped in with the big corporate mega biz pot companies. That's in a whole nother area. But these smaller businesses, they're lobbying, they're doing more activism, they're engaging because they are right in the thick of it. But I can say that for a great number of people who did the heavy lifting for many, many years, who did speak to government bodies, they testified, they presented evidence, they went to court, and nothing good came of it. So for many people, they're quite discouraged. And some of the responses are, why bother? They didn't listen to us the first time. I think the benefit right now is instead of saying, hey, things could be bad, now we can say, hey, things are bad. Like we can look back and say the evidence is in, we need to do something, and that would hopefully encourage people to get more engaged.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. And Chuka, why don't you jump in on this as well? Because I know you've done a lot of work and research and background on drug policy in Canada, and you've been following this debate and the changes that have taken place. So what are your thoughts about the review, and how, is it an important tool that can be used by people?
Well, the arguments that Justin Trudeau and the government made while pursuing and ultimately implementing cannabis legalization explicitly pointed in the direction of reparations. They talked about over-criminalization of Indigenous people and Black people and other racialized people, and talked about the sort of long-term consequences that can have on those people. They neglected to mention two important things. One, that the arguments in favor of cannabis equally apply to all other presently illicit drugs, and two, the consequences of criminalization are also collective, and they end up getting attached to the neighborhoods that if a large number of people in a particular neighborhood bear criminal records, there's an aggregate depressive economic effect. But I think that highlights that this review has to interrogate the degree to which there have been any measures of reparations for the hundreds of thousands of people, literally, that were burdened with cannabis-related criminal records in this country. The sort of paltry uptake of the government's eased pardon application process is one indication of the sort of absolute lack of work on this issue. But as Jodie mentioned, it goes beyond just that level of criminalization. The consequences for employment, for housing, for even being able to spend time with your family, they are multitudinous, and they severely restrict people's life course outcomes. There must be meaningful acknowledgement of this and engagement on the government to seek to provide reparative programs for people that have been burdened with these records. That means housing, that means mortgage loans, it means increased access to housing, job training. The idea that you can say, we've been doing this horrifically racist and abusive thing for 100 years, and we're just going to stop doing it, and that's supposed to be enough, is ludicrous. There has to be reparations, and the government hasn't even begun that work.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, and we are going to come back to that question specifically, Chuka, about reparations. But I just want to go back to Jodie, because Jodie, as we noted in the introduction, you've been a very key leader in the cannabis activism in Canada, especially during those really, really tough decades when criminalization of people who use marijuana was rampant and unforgiving. And you've said in the past, after legalization took place, and I'm quoting you here, you said the cannabis industry shouldn't be stolen from the grassroots. And end of quote. And I was very struck by that, because the data does show us, so we're sort of switching topic here a little bit away from the review, but the data does show us that industry is now very much dominated by big business, including, and this drives me mad, I'm sure it does you too, many of the former cops and politicians who were big advocates of criminalization in the past. There they are all lined up, waiting for the big bucks. So I guess my question to you, Jodie, is did legalization in Canada turn out the way you hoped it would?
Absolutely not. And it's fascinating to see how language can be twisted so much. Again, now people say it's legal in Canada, job done. And it's like, well, that's not the legal we were talking about, because they didn't legalize what was supposed to be legalized. They created an entire new industry. In my mind, legalization meant three things: stop criminalizing the people, stop criminalizing the industry that already exists despite enormous law enforcement costs and punishments, and acknowledge that it's not something to be criminalized. So the Liberal, Trudeau, he first jumped on board because basically Canadians said, we all know people who use pot. We don't care about it. It shouldn't be criminal. Let's just legalize it. Dispensaries are everywhere. Products are everywhere. There's a lot of self-regulation in the cannabis industry. Let's make it legitimate regulation, similar to Uber or Airbnb or even farmers markets. You can properly regulate these industries. But then the government started to lean towards much more harsh language, talking about how cannabis is a threat to public health and safety, and therefore we need to keep criminalizing it because gangs and kids and gangs and kids and driving and gangs and kids. And they just kept repeatedly hammering away at this idea that we're only legalizing it because it's dangerous and terrible, which means we need more laws, we need more restrictions. In fact, we used to have 8 cannabis laws under the CDSA, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. They increased it to 45 federal laws, and then it trickled down to introduce new prohibitions and restrictions on provincial and municipal levels. So instead of just one bad law federally, it started to turn into this Medusa-like monster of recriminalization, and the government's language shifted towards, we're not going to legalize what already exists, even though the Justice Department statistics said 95% of cannabis growers, completely law-abiding Canadians who just want to be legal. The government said they're all criminals. The only people that will grow it legally are a few companies that we're choosing that you can invest in with your money. And we have over 50 politicians and cops. There's a list on my Twitter account. I call it the unfairness list. Over 50 cops and politicians that I know of on the record who started marijuana companies and started raising money from the stock market. So you had the federal government telling Canadians, we're going to legalize it, but only these new producers, these new corporate venture capitalists, all the other people, we're still going to make sure they're illegal. And that's part of how and why I got arrested and convicted and sentenced, and am now excluded in many ways from the industry, like many other people are. And we just found out yesterday that the Canadian public lost $131 billion investing into pot stocks. These pot stock companies like Canopy, Aurora, and a lot of the big names, they were basically running a giant pot stock scam. They didn't have weed ready. They didn't have anything ready to go, but they were able to raise a lot of money because the federal government kept saying, hey, Canada, it's going to be legal and you can only buy from these guys. It's almost kind of cartel-like, and they told the original pre-existing industry, we're not going to legalize you. You're going to remain illegal. And to this day, yesterday, my friend Neil Magnuson and the Cannabis Substitution Project, they're giving away free and cheap cannabis to people who are addicted to drugs to help them get off the drugs in the downtown east side. And they've been arrested and charged. And in fact, their location was firebombed the other night. So these are people who are being convicted under legalization laws for providing access to medicine. Meanwhile, part of this Cannabis Act review is about whether cannabis should be seen as medicine or not. That's terrifying a lot of patients who depend on marijuana to keep off the opioids, to keep away from alcohol and other harmful substances. And yet the government's making it more and more difficult for people to access that cannabis. And ultimately, the government set up themselves as the middleman. So you can only get cannabis approved by the government and sold through government wholesalers. So they've been doing very well, making a lot of money based on the alcohol model. But as for mom and pop growers, Canadian investors, and the average consumer and medical patient, we're all getting squeezed in a lot of different ways, including with law enforcement, which shouldn't exist when something is supposed to be legalized.
Yeah, well, that's an incredible situation that you've just outlined under so-called legalization, where basically it's now dominated by very big business and everybody else is being frozen out or is being criminalized in other ways. So thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of people just don't really understand, what the legalization regime looks like and what the impact has been. So I'll turn it back to Robin to follow up on some other aspects of this. Robin.
Yeah, no, thanks, Libby, and thanks, Jodie, for that. And everyone, we're talking about, I guess, some of the people who have been harmed by the regime. And I'll go to Dawn now on that. Dawn, as the NDP critic for health, you've been very vocal about Canada's drug policies overall. And you've also called for across-the-board expungement or blanket pardon for marijuana convictions. However, so far, only about 500 applications for pardons have been approved, whereas you pointed out that about 500,000 Canadians have criminal records for simple cannabis possession. So what are the problems with the current pardon process, and how would a blanket pardon actually work? And if you could get into that, if you could maybe talk a bit about what Biden did in the US, because that got a lot of coverage. So people are maybe contrast that with what happened here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'll just describe the difference between expungement and a pardon. So when you have a criminal record in Canada, we've always had a pardon process, and it's basically a legal process that you can apply for if you have not had any criminal record for a certain period of time, usually 5 years. And not all crimes are capable of being pardoned, but a lot are. And the legal effect of that is that you are pardoned for the criminal record. It allows you to legally tell people that you don't have a criminal record. Your record is sealed, but it still exists. So probably everybody's filled out an employment application, and there's a question on there: have you ever been convicted of a criminal record for which a pardon has not been granted? It would allow you to say no to that. But the record still exists somewhere. And it still is able to be used against you in certain legal contexts. For instance, if you were to get into legal trouble in the future, it's not inconceivable that that record can come back and be used against you. And expungement, on the other hand, is a legal process and term that is, once granted, means that the crime never existed. The criminal offense never existed at all. So instead of having a crime record that has been pardoned, it's you have never had the criminal record at all. Now, we warned the government about this at the very beginning. My colleague Murray Rankin, who was justice critic at the time, introduced legislation in the House of Commons in 2019 that would have automatic expungement for all cannabis-related records. In one fell swoop, if we passed that law, boom, everybody in the country that had criminal records for the prescribed list, possession, simple possession, there were lots of different records, would have immediately had their records expunged. They could tell people, I've never been convicted of a crime. The Liberals defeated that legislation. And the other problem about pardons is that the process is expensive, it's complicated, it's time consuming. It's really inaccessible to a lot of people, particularly marginalized people who, don't have access to a lawyer. They don't understand the process. They don't have the money. Now, in August of 2019, in classic Liberal fashion, to move incrementally in a small step, after rejecting our motion to expunge all records, the Liberals launched a program to provide what they said would be no-cost expedited record suspensions for simple possession of cannabis. That still required people to apply. Now, again, if you think of the population that are carrying these records, very often they're people that, were young, they may be from marginalized communities, they may have moved. And incidentally, records are kept in weird places in this country. Like criminal records are in courthouses, in rural areas, they're in police departments. It's not even clear to people where their record is. And so predictably, as you just pointed out, since that attempt by the Liberals, the Parole Board of Canada has received only 972 applications for record suspensions. And of those 972 applications, only 628 have been granted. So you can see it's been an utter failure. And by the way, there's examples where they have used expungement. My colleague Randall Garrison played a strong role in getting expungements for three criminal provisions concerning the criminalization of homosexuality that were in the criminal code. And when those were removed from the criminal code, the government expunged all the records. They didn't make people who carried convictions have to apply and then get a pardon. They just expunged it because they never should have been crimes in the first place. And that's the other policy I think that's important. We believe that cannabis possession and cannabis usage never should have been a crime. So to expunge it is a societal recognition that there never should have been a crime. You never committed a crime. That's different than saying it was a crime and now we forgive you. Finally, I'll just say about, it's pretty bad when a US president is more progressive than Canada on anything. But in October, just last month, US President Joe Biden, he issued an executive order that would provide a full and unconditional pardon for all individuals convicted of simple cannabis possession under federal law. Now, it's like everything American, it's highly conditional because a lot of the convictions in the US are at the state level. But nevertheless, it does reflect a policy choice by the highest office holder in the United States that society to start, as Chuka mentioned, to start the process of trying to undo some of the massive generational harms that have been done. Society at least should recognize that everybody should have their records eliminated immediately. And but that's not the case in Canada today.
In fact, I'd like to note that the Liberal government did say when legalization was being discussed, Bill Blair would note that it was a great injustice what was happening with cannabis prohibition. Trudeau himself said we're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars arresting peaceful Canadians. It's an injustice. But as soon as we started saying, well, if it is a great historical injustice, let's have expungement, they said, well, actually, it's still criminal. We're still arresting people. We're still, enforcing the law. So it would be very hard for them to play both sides of it. And my only concern about Biden is that, similar to Trudeau, says the right things, gets people excited, but it might just be to pump up the companies that are ready and willing to jump onto this opportunity to take over a new creation of an industry to be stolen from the grassroots. That's a concern, but we definitely need expungement for all non-violent cannabis offenses, not just possession.
Totally agree.
That is a great segue to the next question, which is to you, Chuka, and that is, part of the cannabis review that we spoke about earlier is looking at the impact of legalization on Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, and youth. What advice would you give to this expert panel, which hasn't been fully named yet, as they undertake the review? What should they focus on? You're on mute, my brother.
Sorry about that. Well, we talked about reparations a bit, but I sort of want to go into go into it a bit more. The demographic groups that have been most targeted by drug prohibition, Indigenous people and Black people, are not it's not arbitrary that those are the two groups, right? Indigenous people suffer an ongoing genocide in this country. Black people experienced slavery in this country. These are two demographic groups that still across policy areas experience disproportionate rates of poverty, medical racism, inequity in various sectors. So the need for reparations isn't just about the racism that people that those groups experienced through the policing that resulted from drug prohibition. And it's important to note that racism wasn't an sort of unexpected and unfortunate byproduct of drug prohibition. It was the explicit purpose. Many of the initial laws which sought to prohibit drugs were implemented in response to significant levels of immigration from a particular country. There are in a number of countries, I believe in Canada included, the initial laws against opium were a response to Chinese immigration, for example. So racism was the point, right? And it was built into the structure through its entirety. And so the need to provide reparations isn't just about drug prohibition itself, it's also about drug prohibition as a constitutive element of a larger structure of racism and exploitation that really does define countries in what we call the West. And so, you know, there's a city in Illinois called Evanston, and they've been using the proceeds from legal cannabis sales to provide reparations for citizens in the city who have been, I think it was maybe 1 or 2 generations prior, had also lived there, and they were descendants of enslaved Africans. And they weren't, you know, there wasn't really a sort of need to say this is like we're using this for specifically only people who have been affected by drug prohibition. I think one thing that's been one thing that's been pointed to as a measure of reparations in a lot of places, priority access to the legal market. I find it extremely troubling that people would advance the argument that simply because you were arrested and bear a criminal record for having possessed a drug at some point prior in your life, your primary economic opportunity for the rest of your life should be in the legal market that has now been created for that drug. It's still not providing people self-determination, which is ultimately what criminalization robs people of. Your life course outcomes are restricted in more ways than we have time to discuss in this program. And so if the government spoke about this as a historical injustice, there must be serious reparations, and there's been effectively nothing. I think it is absolutely deplorable. And if this review is to take seriously about the arguments made in favor of legalization that talked about justice, again, arguments that saying that if a substance is going to be used, then it's best to have it produced safely in a safe environment to ensure that the product, when it's used, isn't going to have adverse consequences. That equally applies to every other drug. These are the people who talk about evidence-based policy, but they won't look at the sort of evidence implicated in their own arguments. It's I think that the fact that the Liberal government was able to sort of get a political win out of this without having to seriously engage with a century of history of racism, of violence and deprivation is absolutely shameful.
Yeah, and could I just jump back to you for a second. The questions that Chuka has raised about reparations as it relates to this review, I'm just curious to know if you are aware, is there any parliamentary oversight of this review? Like, we know that the chair has been named, I forget the person's name, it's a former deputy minister. As far as I'm aware, the other members of the review panel haven't been named, but are you aware, Dawn, that there's going to be a parliamentary committee review of the review, or how is that going to play out? Any insight on that?
That's a great question, Libby, and the answer so far is no, there isn't. It's funny, when I was reviewing the law way back when, first of all, they wanted a review after 5 years. It was one of the NDP's amendments that got it cut down to 3, because we could see how many structural problems there were. And I just want to say, Jodie and I, at the time, we both said it's a curious legalization where you end up with more criminal offenses after legalization than exist before, which is the case. A kid outside walking down the street with more than an ounce of cannabis can go to jail for 14 years. You grow 5 plants in your house, go to jail for 14 years. I could back up my pickup truck to a liquor store and load it up with 12 cases of scotch and go camping, and that's totally legal. But I can't take 2 ounces of weed with me to camping. So you can see all that. So I got to tell you, Libby, that at the time of the review, we thought the review meant to come back before a parliamentary committee, because after all, the legislation was really gone through in great detail at the committee. I think Jodie testified at it. But this review is an internal ministry review. It's just internal to the department. And I wanted to say as well, I couldn't agree more with what I'm hearing from my co-panelists, but really what they created was Cannabis Inc. This review is really focusing on the issues that the large cannabis companies are having with the difficulties they're having, like things like THC concentrations in liquid form, because there's some ridiculous rules around that. You can only buy I think a 5-pack of cannabis infused beverage because of the way that they mistakenly calculated the THC levels as opposed to dry goods. So, what I'm starting to become very concerned about and committed to is finding a way to get this review back before Parliament so we can hear from Canadians. It shouldn't be like a private, almost privileged access to the department while they work on how they can make the industry work better for the large corporations that have basically benefited, well, arguably benefited, because as Jodie pointed out, Canopy was $75 a share, a year ago. It's under $5 now. Aurora lost $600 million in Q2 this year. So they're all getting hammered. And I just want to end by saying the reason for that speaks to something Chuka mentioned. Successful legalization should have been to bring everybody who was operating in the illicit market into the light. And there should have been low barrier entries. That's actually part of the reparation process that Chuka so eloquently described, where all those people who had been producing and victimized should have been brought in, and we should have been, frankly, harnessing their talents and their knowledge and their skills. And one of the reasons I think, what I hear, I don't really smoke anymore, but I hear that most of the products in some of the legal market is really not very good. And it's still the high quality stuff that people want is still being produced in the illicit market. And so, ironically, those brave souls who risk their lives and reputations to keep cannabis genetic lines active during prohibition, and who may have gotten a criminal record, are now prohibited from participating in the illicit market because of their criminal record. And so that's not only unfair to them, it's not only unjust, it not only perpetuates injustice, but also, I think actually it hampers the development of a strong market, because you want those people brought in. I think it costs, I don't even know the number now, but I think you're talking seven figures. You're in $1 million plus if you want to be licensed as a producer in this country. The retailers that have come to me, like, it takes 2 years sometimes to get licensed. It's enormously difficult. So a lot of those people are just saying, forget it. And that's why 50% of the cannabis industry is still produced in the so-called illicit market. And I think that's a real indictment of any claim by liberals that they've legalized anything.
Yes, the barriers to entry are so high. And one of the most appalling things I think needs to be noted is that we have a system where the provincial governments are responsible for the wholesale delivery of cannabis, but not only that, they're in charge of licensing stores. And we've had a few cases here in BC with the Cowichan tribes on the island and elsewhere, people who have been trying to get a license for a First Nations cannabis store that's legal and licensed. They go to the provincial government and ask for licensing, and the provincial government comes along and opens up their own BC cannabis store in the very same shopping mall plaza, opening up their own store funded by taxpayers before the First Nations store is even allowed to get licensed to operate. So you have a system that we tried to challenge actually in the Supreme Court of Canada. Don, you mentioned pulling up your truck and getting a bunch of booze. Well, in fact, a gentleman did that between Quebec and New Brunswick, went to federal court to argue that we should dismantle this alcohol monopoly. Unfortunately, that case was lost. My group, Cannabis Culture, we intervened and appeared and argued that cannabis must not be made out in the same model as alcohol, or you would end up with this problem with a monopoly of sorts that small producers and retailers would not be able to compete with. So that's a problem right now that continues to affect marginalized groups, people without the money and means and connections, people with criminal records, the ones who actually engaged in the activism and supplying access when needed, who won in court repeatedly to provide access, still as individuals blocked out. I've been trying to get licensed for many years now. Been a while, still not happened, working on it still, but I know many others are in the same boat, and it's a problem that's much bigger than just federal law. I think we have issues on the provincial and local levels as well that keeps people locked out from participating.
I know we've got lots of questions that are starting to come in, but before I hand it back over to Robin, I've just got one last question for each of you as a panelist. And first of all, you've done a fantastic job of really shedding light on the problems that the legalization regime has created in Canada over the last 4 years. And so really the last question is, this struggle to end the so-called war on drugs has just been so enormously harmful over such, 100 plus years. And I think it sort of begs the question, what is the impact of the legalization of cannabis in this larger context of drug policy reform in Canada? And I guess it sort of begs the question, what have we learned, through this legalization process? And are we headed in the right direction? Now, I think I can already say that you're all going to say, no, we're not headed in the right direction. But, it's... there are so many other issues related to drug policy in Canada in terms of prohibition that still plays out and is destroying people's lives. So just a few thoughts from each of you in terms of the bigger question of drug policy reform in Canada. And Chuka, why don't we begin with you, and then we'll go to Jodie and then Dawn, if you just kind of want to give a couple minutes each on that.
I'll be quick.
Okay.
Or I'll be as quick as possible. First is, I think it's really important to recognize that, again, the arguments that the government made about the necessity of having a safe supply of a substance if it was going to be used to ensure that there wouldn't be adverse effects, that is an act of care, right? To provide a safe supply of drugs is an act of care and an act of humanity. We must recognize that that's necessary for other presently illicit substances. People are dying needlessly. Thousands of people have died in Canada in recent years from preventable drug poisonings because we are refusing to provide a safe supply. It is inhumane that we've allowed this to go on so long, and I hope that this review, that there's sincere engagement with that. The other thing I'd like to note is that the war on drugs, I think it's important for us to recognize, even though that this aspect of it hasn't taken as much root in Canada, the war on drugs has been a global scourge that has unleashed untold amounts of violence. It has also been a key aspect of neoliberal state formations that has increased securitization, increased the militarization of police. For example, it was through drug prohibition that the US military was first permitted to transfer or sell equipment to US police departments. The impact of the war on drugs in countries outside of countries to the south of the US, countries in South America and Latin America, has been truly horrific. The lucrative consumer markets in Canada, in the US, and in Western Europe have had really, really just brutal effects on countries where there is a significant amount of drug production or there's a significant amount of transfer of large quantities of drugs over significant distances. They've enriched corrupt politicians. They've led to the enrichment of people who have no qualms about using violence to secure profit, for whom there's a sort of new illicit industry to pursue. The amount of scholarship on this is incredible. The governments that the U.S., for example, has propped up throughout South America and Latin America simply because they assented to the U.S.'s draconian drug policies, additionally horrific, additionally abusive of human rights. I think that there's really looking at the history of the war on drugs it's a history of limitless horrors, as so many things are in this hemisphere and across the world, honestly. But I hope that if the purpose of changing drug policy was to end racism, was to end a structure of violence, of harm, of deprivation, was to remove those structures from our world, then there's much more work ahead of us if we want to continue to do that.
Okay, thanks so much, Chuka. And just a quick comment from Jodie and then Dawn on this bigger question.
Well,
I know we could get into it a lot more.
There's certainly a lot of drug harm hypocrisy that we see, that a lot of this talk about keeping drugs illegal for protecting people's health, and yet there's nothing done about alcohol, tobacco, even sugar and pharmaceutical drugs that do harm and kill people, activities every day. So the hypocrisy is grating on people. The war on drugs has been used worldwide to tie into the war on terror and all sorts of wars on humanity. I find the legalization topic interesting because when Washington State finally legalized in 2012, 2012. I was a part of that. And a lot of activists were very critical, saying it doesn't go far enough. This is bad legalization. And I said, take what you can get and always ask for more. You can fix it later, but just changing it here will send a message worldwide. Canada, same thing. I'm very sour about the way it went. We tried to make it better. But to be fair, the world said Canada legalized. And now you have places like Thailand and other countries who are doing it in a much better way. And Canada is now an example of what not to do. And they can do something better by looking at where we failed. So the bigger picture worldwide, ending prohibition, I think we're moving in the right direction. The biggest issue we have is government and corporations colluding together to regulate these substances in such a way that it maintains criminalization for a select few groups of people and minorities and marginalized folks, and maintains a lot of money and opportunity for their cronies and friends. So we just have to get the money out of politics and let people have freedom of choice and look towards harm reduction, but letting people make choices for themselves, for their health and their pleasure, with as little government involvement in that as possible, except for bare minimum safety standards, which we can all agree on, I'm sure. So take what you can get, always ask for more. We're on the right road.
Thanks, Jodie. And Don, just a last comment from you.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I very much share Jodie's perspective. I mean, it's definitely been a mixed experience with legalization, but if you ask me and you put thumb screws on me and force me to tell you if I thought we're moving in the right direction, I would say yes. You know, it's definitely a step in the right direction, because, you know, as flawed as it is, we don't have, you know, 17-year-old kids or 19-year-old people or people who are getting busted for simply having possession of cannabis anymore. You know, people are able to access quality products and smoke in their personal lives if they want to. You can even grow your own. You can grow up to 4 plants in your own house, which I think was an inspired, by the way, we pushed that as well. Do you know that there was a limit of 1 meter per plant on this as well? It was ridiculous. I proved you could have a plant in the size of a gymnasium that was no higher than 1 meter. So we got rid of the 1 meter thing. But the other thing I think that's important is what's implicit, Libby, is I think a recognition that drug use, cannabis use, I think at this point, is not a moral failing. It's not a character flaw. It's a personal choice. And in some people where it possibly could be a health challenge, but if it is a health challenge, then you deal with it as a health issue, not as a criminal matter. And so to the extent that legalization of cannabis in Canada has achieved that incremental step, I think it's in the right direction. And I wanted to say, our own party, Libby, I mean, you were a champion. I just want to take a moment and say, I walk on the shoulders of giants. You were out there, you know, bravely advocating for this when it was costly to do so, and you did it anyway. You know, we were wrong because the NDP, we stayed with decriminalization for long, and we allowed the Liberals to leapfrog over and talk about legalization, which was the right policy. And it still is the right policy, even though the way it's been rolled out is so frustratingly, maddeningly insufficient. It's still in the right direction, but way more work to do.
Back to you, Robin.
Thank you. Hey, excellent discussion so far, and now we're gonna get into some audience questions. And actually, we've got a couple that have come in. There's one specifically for Jodie and Chuka, so I'm going to give you those. But before we get into that, though, I want to ask a question about data. Okay, so specifically, like I've heard some data on. Like I went to a Health Canada conference, and the data about the ownership of the businesses are like 84% white guys, I suppose. But I'm curious, Chuka, data on the 500,000 people who have records. Is there disaggregated data on that in terms of the number of Indigenous people and Black people who have those records, or is that even come up?
I haven't found disaggregated data on that, but in Canada, as far as I know, there is not much racially disaggregated data available on many aspects. So a lot of the trends and the sort of racialized trends in drug-related criminalization that have have come out of research were about the United States. There are very similar trends visible in Canada, but the extent of research hasn't been conducted in Canada in comparison to the US. That being said, the research that has been conducted in Canada does support and demonstrate disproportionate criminalization of Indigenous people and Black people in criminal records, in street checks, in arrests, in criminal sentencing. But the 500,000 number, I haven't seen racially disaggregated data on that.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to ask the question. So Chuka, I'll ask them. Chuka, you go first, and then Jodie. So the question for you, Chuka, and this relates, is Chuka, can you tell us more about the idea of reparations? What specifically would you like to see done? So then we'll let you answer that. And then after that, Jodie, for you, Jodie, can you elaborate on the action you mentioned where activists are giving cannabis to hard drug users in the downtown east side? So let's go Chuka first and then Jodie.
Yeah, so I think there's two forms of reparations. One is to some degree, or one is about the individual consequences that people experience. Other is about aggregate consequences. In terms of the individual consequences, if you have a criminal record, there are certain employments that you are prohibited from attaining. You'll have increased difficulty getting a loan or mortgage, increased difficulty finding housing, things like that. And so reparative programs in that regard would be ideally government revenues, funds that are used to make reparative programs available that allow people who have been burdened by these criminal records to go into those areas. So, a fund of mortgage loans for people who have had criminal records, of job training in medicine or nursing or childcare or finance for people who've had criminal records, all areas that they would have been had extreme significant difficulty or been prohibited from working in. So that is the sort of reparations that looks at the individual barriers that people experience. The aggregate is about recognizing that if a significant number of people in a given neighborhood have criminal records, there's an aggregate depressive economic effect. The overall economic health of the area suffers, and therefore it becomes sort of less attractive to public or private investment or what have you, which has a sort of additional kind of knock-on depressive economic effect. And so the government has to recognize that that criminalization that has been targeted has created that circumstance, and then offer reparative funds for those communities to spend as they choose on themselves. That's my view.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. And then I'll just hear Jodie repeat the question. Jodie, can you elaborate on the action you mentioned where activists are giving cannabis to hard drug users in the downtown east side?
Yes, actually, for many, many years, cannabis legalization activism was based in the medical cannabis access activism. The cannabis community, mostly patients who use marijuana as medicine, would regularly get arrested and charged for providing access to cannabis to people who are sick with cancer or people who want to stop using heroin. And these consumers and their providers ended up going to court, and many times they would win. The court would agree that they were being forced to violate their freedom and liberty in pursuit of health and security. So many times the courts would say, government, you have to provide access to marijuana. You have to. It's a charter protected issue. You need to make sure there's access. So the medical marijuana movement is really what pushed forward with cannabis. And a lot of that was based on the issue of drug harms being caused by other drugs. People want to use cannabis instead of alcohol. It's a safer choice for recreation, or they want to use it to get off opioids. We started seeing in the United States, a lot of states would legalize medical marijuana. And the data shows that many of those states saw a reduction in opioid use and abuse. I started collecting a lot of these studies. I did, in fact, present some of it at the health committee that Dawn mentioned, and I'm very grateful you invited me to present there. I presented this data, and I presented it to the city of Vancouver, to the mayor and city council when they were shutting down medical dispensaries. I said, here's the science. When you increase access to cannabis, you reduce opioid deaths by up to 30%. That's a tremendous number. And yet no action taken on it. And in fact, we're seeing all across Canada, there are different groups like the Cannabis Substitution Project. That's the one in Vancouver on the downtown east side. There are advocates across Canada in the eastern provinces, in Ontario. They're doing the same thing. They're providing low cost or free cannabis to people who use drugs and are suffering from addiction, and people are getting off of those drugs. I've met them. Their life is being saved by cannabis access. And yet these groups are being persecuted and charged under the Cannabis Act because they don't have a license for medical cannabis. But the thing is, you can't get a license to sell medical cannabis through a storefront. You can only get cannabis as medicine through the mail, through these licensed producers who are also producing recreational marijuana. Cannabis, medical, recreational, same plant. It just treats people in different ways. But the real tragedy right now is that you have the people who are doing the boldest work, helping the most marginalized among us, and they're being punished and persecuted for it. And there are groups like the in Victoria, there's the Cannabis Buyers Club. They're also trying to get licensed, and they've had support from city officials, and yet the community safety unit, which you think is about safety, but community safety unit is only cannabis enforcement, completely set up only to enforce cannabis laws. These groups are going around shutting down the access providers and charging them. So that's really criminal in my mind, that the government talks a lot about public health and safety and the opioid crisis. And yet when it comes to the people actually saving lives and preventing harm, they're being harmed themselves and having their lives destroyed. So that's maddening to me. And I think we need to refocus on cannabis as medicine. It's not a threat to public health and safety. And as Dawn said, if you struggle with it, don't use it, get some help. That's cool. We don't need a giant regime to handle people who can't handle weed. We need, in terms of reparations and recognition of the harm done, that the harm continues. And, you know, I spent nearly 5 years visiting prisons in Mississippi and Georgia, and I can tell you the generational harm of these laws goes far beyond the people who actually use the substances themselves. These children visiting their parents in prison, that's harm that I don't know if you can undo it, but we need to at least talk about it instead of sweeping it under the rug.
Yep. No, thank you for that. We have, this is a great way to end. We have time for one last question, and you have to all give very short answers to this, but here it is. I worry that high-ranking members in the Liberal Party of Canada, whose early investments in the cannabis industry are now in the tank, will continue to shape policy to rehabilitate their stock values, and that aspiration will continue to drive cannabis policy. Any comments from the panelists?
Well, I'll say corruption is nonpartisan. Yes, a lot of liberals got in there, so did conservatives. It's mostly opportunists who see a way to cash in and take advantage of a situation. Again, that's why we need government and business to stop being engaged with each other in that way. I think we should have just let it be the grassroots, let the small producers and access providers have a chance to succeed. That was the best way to go.
Thank you. Let's go to Chuka and then Dawn for the last remark. But Chuka first. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to that specific circumstance. I do think that I don't think it's appropriate for elected officials to be making stock investments, seemingly when their work could have implications on the performance of any various stock. I think that is dubious on its face, and I have to say, I think a circumstance in which most elected people are wealthy, most elected people are significantly wealthier than the vast majority of people in the country, also kind of dubious on its face.
Thank you. And Don, last word.
Short snappers, there's Nancy Pelosi's in Canada too. It's the first thing I'll tell you. I also want to just mention, I'm sure that there are absolutely racialized impacts, even if we don't have the data yet. But one thing I do know for sure is that there's a class issue. You know who gets hurt the most from this is poor people across all sections. And my final point would be the one thing that I have hope in is it's my experience that the population is way ahead of politicians when it comes to drug policy. And that's because there's not a family in this country, not one, that it doesn't have experience with drug use. And so I think that what we have to do is there's 3 rules that should guide our drug policy. The product should be safe, it should be well labeled, and keep it out of the hands of children. Other than that, let people do what they want to do with these substances, and that would be progressive drug policy for the 21st century.
Well, that's a good way to end, Don. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. And I want to say that They were great questions, and you have been fantastic panelists. Just the wealth of information. You've shed so much light on what the issues are around the legalization regime that we have and what we need to do. So I really want to thank Chuka and Jodie and Dawn for being part of this great conversation today. And of course, a thank you to my co-host, Robin Browne. We will be back off the Hill in December for our final Off the Hill panel. I can't believe that it's almost the end of the year, so be sure to get an invitation for that event for signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca /subscribe. And thank you to Rabble. It's so important that we have this kind of space and openness and dialogue and conversation about some of these issues. And Rabble provides that space, and we always have a great time on Off the Hill. So thank you to everybody, to our panelists, for everyone for tuning in tonight. Thank you to Rabble, and we'll see you in December.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Good night.